Imagine a child crouched on the floor, crayons scattered across a rough surface, sketching a picture of what they call home. But the picture is not filled with trees, pets, and smiling faces. Instead, the child carefully draws smoke curling above rooftops, planes dark against the sky, and fire burning where the house should be. For them, this is not imagination, it is memory. Another child clutches a worn stuffed toy while huddled underground, flinching at every distant rumble. Their heartbeat races at sounds most of us would dismiss as ordinary: a car backfiring, a door slamming, thunder in the distance. For them, every noise is a warning. They have no memories of a life before this, no sense of what normal feels like. In a camp far away from what once was home, a little girl recites the alphabet under a sheet of plastic that passes for a roof. Her face lights up at every letter, but when asked what she dreams of, her answer is not to become a teacher, a doctor, or an artist. Instead, she whispers, "I dream of not hearing guns." Now, pause for a moment. Think back to your own earliest memories. Maybe they are filled with birthdays, laughter in a schoolyard, or falling asleep in your own bed knowing you were safe. For millions of children, those same formative years are filled instead with the sounds of sirens, the sting of hunger, the constant absence of safety. And this brings us to the central question. What happens to a generation when their very first memories are filled with war? Psychologists, humanitarian workers, and survivors tell us that the scars of war don't just fade when the fighting stops. They become woven into the fabric of a child's developing mind. They shape how that child grows, how they trust, how they see themselves and others, and ultimately, how they live their lives. We are not talking about temporary nightmares. We are talking about long-term post-traumatic stress disorder, chronic anxiety, depression, and generational trauma wounds that can last decades, even centuries, as they ripple across families and communities. History confirms this truth. From conflicts long past to those unfolding today, children who grow up in the shadow of war carry invisible scars into adulthood. These scars affect not only their individual futures, but also the collective future of their societies. But here's what we often fail to confront. These children are not only victims. They are the next generation, the citizens, workers, parents, and leaders who will shape the world we all share. The way war molds their lives will, in time, mold ours too. In this journey, we will explore the psychology of war's youngest witnesses. We will look at what science tells us about trauma in developing brains, what history reveals about the long-term effects, and how resilience can emerge against all odds. We will hear not just statistics, but stories, and we will confront the moral questions that demand answers. What responsibility do we carry as a global community toward these children? What does it mean to grow up when innocence itself has been stolen? And how can we ensure that children inherit not trauma, but hope? Children should not be defined by war, yet millions are. And the question remains, what will the world do about it? To understand the psychological cost of war on children, we need to begin with scope. Today, nearly 1 in 6 children worldwide lives in a conflict zone, according to humanitarian reports. That means tens of millions are waking up each day, not in the safety of classrooms or playgrounds, but in landscapes of instability and fear. Their homes may be damaged or destroyed. Their schools may be closed or unsafe. Their families may be separated, scattered, or grieving. For them, childhood is not a sanctuary. It is a battlefield. This reality is not confined to one place or one moment in history. Past conflicts across different continents tell us the same story. When war strikes, children suffer uniquely and profoundly. Decades later, survivors of wars long ended still carry the memories of hiding in basements, fleeing their homes, or losing loved ones in the chaos. Researchers who studied those who were children during these conflicts consistently find higher rates of depression, anxiety, and struggles with identity well into adulthood. So why is childhood so deeply affected by war? The answer lies in development. Children are in the process of learning what the world is and how they fit into it. They are supposed to be forming secure attachments, discovering curiosity, and exploring safely under the watchful eyes of caregivers. When that process is shattered by war, the consequences are not just immediate, they are developmental. There are 3 layers of loss children often endure in war. The first is the loss of safety. The home, which should be a refuge, becomes a place of risk. Sudden noises trigger panic. The unpredictability of violence creates constant vigilance. For a child whose brain is designed to thrive on predictability and stability, this is devastating. The second is the loss of education. Schools where children should learn, socialize, and imagine their futures often close or collapse during conflict. Teachers are displaced. Families are forced to move. An entire generation misses out on structured learning. The academic delay is critical, but even more important is the social and emotional support that schools provide. Without that anchor, children lose one of their greatest defenses against trauma. The third is the loss of community. War scatters families, neighbors, and friends. Children may be separated from their parents or siblings. Familiar faces vanish. Community rituals and traditions disappear. This loss cuts away at the roots of identity, leaving children unmoored in a world already defined by chaos. The statistics reveal the scale of this crisis. Millions of children worldwide are displaced by conflict, forced to live not for days or weeks, but for years in temporary shelters or refugee camps. For many, this becomes their entire childhood. Imagine growing up with no sense of permanence, moving from camp to camp, waiting endlessly for stability that never arrives. Such experiences don't just change how children see the world, they change who those children become. But it is not only the present generation we must consider. The psychological impacts of war ripple forward into the future through intergenerational trauma. This phenomenon occurs when the trauma of one generation is unconsciously passed down to the next. Children who never lived through the original conflict may still grow up shaped by its shadow through the fears, coping behaviors, and unhealed wounds of their parents and grandparents. This has been observed in communities across the world, from survivors of mass violence to refugees who fled wars decades ago. Children of survivors often describe growing up in households dominated by silence, mistrust, or unresolved grief. They may inherit not only the biological markers of stress, but also the cultural memory of fear. This raises an uncomfortable truth. War is never truly over when the fighting stops. Its echoes live on in the children who experienced it, and in the generations that follow. And perhaps the most heartbreaking fact is this: children do not start wars. They do not sign treaties or lead armies. Yet they bear the heaviest burdens. They lose homes, families, schools, and communities. They lose stability, safety, and innocence. The very things childhood should guarantee are stripped away, replaced with survival instincts far beyond their years. Yet even here, amid devastation, there is another side to the story. Children are not only fragile, they are also remarkably resilient. Many who endure early hardship grow into adults with profound empathy, creativity, and determination. But resilience does not happen by accident. It requires support, safety, and care, the very things most absent in war. Without them, trauma hardens, spreading like cracks in a foundation that will one day hold the weight of an entire life. This is the context in which we must examine the psychology of war's youngest survivors. The issue is not only humanitarian, though the moral urgency is undeniable. It is also psychological, cultural, and philosophical. It forces us to ask questions not just about what war does to children in the moment, but what it does to all of us in the long run. To truly grasp the cost of war, we must look not only at destroyed buildings or shifting borders, but at the playgrounds that are empty, the classrooms that are silent, and the childhoods that will never be the same. Because it is in those spaces where innocence should thrive that the real devastation of war is written. When war touches the life of a child, the consequences are not measured only in rubble or lost years of schooling. The most profound damages are often invisible psychological wounds that cannot be seen but are carried for a lifetime. Unlike physical injuries, these wounds are hidden beneath the surface, yet they shape the very architecture of a developing mind. For children, trauma is not simply an event. It is a state of being. Their nervous systems are in constant overdrive, their sense of safety shattered, their ability to trust eroded. Let's explore the 3 major ways this manifests: post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, chronic anxiety and depression, and intergenerational trauma. Post-traumatic stress disorder is one of the most common mental health consequences of growing up in war zones. For adults, PTSD often shows up as flashbacks, nightmares, or hypervigilance. In children, it takes on a different and often more disruptive form. A child with PTSD may suddenly scream at the sound of thunder, mistaking it for an attack. They may be unable to concentrate in class because their minds are hijacked by intrusive memories. Night after night, they may wake up sobbing, reliving moments no child should ever experience. Even their play around that should be filled with imagination and innocence may become a reenactment of violence, repeating scenes they've witnessed. Studies from international health organizations show that children exposed to prolonged conflict are at least twice as likely to develop PTSD compared to those who experience isolated traumatic events. Unlike adults, children often lack the words to explain what they're going through. Their trauma is expressed in behavior, sudden aggression, withdrawal, or extreme clinginess. Too often, these signals are misread by adults who are themselves overwhelmed. The long-term consequences are devastating. Left untreated, PTSD in children can persist into adulthood, interfering with education, employment, and the ability to form relationships. It locks them in a perpetual cycle of fear, even when the world around them has moved on. If PTSD is the replay of specific horrors, anxiety and depression are the daily soundtrack of life in conflict. For children, whose sense of stability is already fragile, the unpredictability of war can be unbearable. Imagine waking up every day not knowing if you will eat, if you will go to school, if you will even see your family again. That constant uncertainty breeds chronic anxiety. Children may refuse to be separated from their caregivers, terrified of losing them. They may develop nervous habits, from nail biting to stuttering. Their bodies are in a permanent state of fight or flight, flooded with stress hormones that erode health over time. Depression often follows. For children who have lost family members, homes, or entire communities, sadness becomes overwhelming. Play disappears. Laughter vanishes. They no longer ask, "What will I be when I grow up?" because the very idea of a future feels impossible. Research indicates that rates of depression and anxiety in conflict-affected children are significantly higher than in peers outside war zones. These conditions don't just fade when the fighting ends. They become embedded, coloring the way children see the world for decades. A child who grows up believing the world is unsafe will struggle to ever fully believe otherwise. Perhaps the most haunting impact of war on children is what psychologists call intergenerational trauma. This is the invisible inheritance passed down from one generation to the next, even long after the conflict has ended. Biological research shows that trauma can alter the way genes are expressed. This means that children of survivors may carry heightened stress responses, even if they never directly experienced war themselves. It is as if trauma etches itself into the body, leaving fingerprints on future generations. But generational trauma is not just biological. It is emotional, cultural, and social. Parents who grew up in fear may unconsciously pass on their anxieties, either by being overprotective or emotionally distant. Families may avoid discussing painful histories, creating silence that weighs heavily on children. Communities may cling to narratives of loss or vengeance, shaping collective identity in ways that make healing difficult. This is why the impact of war rarely ends when peace agreements are signed. The children of war carry scars that shape their parenting, their relationships, and their societies. Trauma becomes a legacy, echoing forward into the lives of children not yet born. The scope of this psychological crisis is staggering. Reports from humanitarian organizations estimate that 1 in 5 children living in conflict zones suffers from a mental health disorder, most commonly PTSD, anxiety, or depression. In some areas, the numbers are far higher. Behind every statistic lies a human story. A child too frightened to sleep alone. A teenager who cannot finish school because panic attacks make it impossible to concentrate. A young adult who carries the nightmares of childhood into every relationship. These struggles are not temporary inconveniences. They shape entire lives, and the tragedy is compounded by the lack of resources. In many war-affected regions, mental health services are minimal or non-existent. Even when aid reaches displaced families, the priority is often food, shelter, and medical care. Psychological wounds, being invisible, are left untreated. Yet they may prove just as lethal in the long run, leading to cycles of violence, poverty, and despair. It is tempting to think of children in war as resilient by nature, and in some ways, they are. Many develop remarkable survival skills, adapting to environments that would break most adults. But survival has a cost. To endure daily trauma, children often shut down parts of themselves: curiosity, vulnerability, trust. Those costs accumulate silently, only to surface later in life as difficulties in relationships, work, and identity. This is why the psychological impact of war on children cannot be seen as a side effect of conflict. It is one of its central consequences. Destroyed buildings can be rebuilt. Economies can recover. But a damaged childhood can never be fully restored. When entire generations grow up in conflict zones, the risks extend beyond the individual. These children will become the adults who lead, work, and raise families in the future. If they carry unresolved trauma, that trauma will ripple outward, shaping societies for decades. It may show up in political instability, cycles of violence, or widespread mistrust. In this way, the suffering of children today becomes the instability of tomorrow. That is why psychologists, humanitarian workers, and philosophers alike insist, to understand the true cost of war, we must look not just at battlefields, but at classrooms, playgrounds, and homes. We must listen not just to generals and politicians, but to the children whose voices are so often drowned out by the noise of conflict. As we continue, we will hear the personal stories of children who have lived through these realities. Stories that bring the statistics to life and remind us that behind every number is a human being with hopes, fears, and a future. We will also look at the science of trauma, exploring how war shapes the developing brain and what factors can help children recover. Because while the damage is real, so too is the possibility of healing if the world is willing to invest in it. Statistics can tell us the scale of suffering, but they cannot capture its soul. To truly understand the long-term psychological cost of growing up in conflict zones, we must step closer. We must listen to the voices of children themselves, voices that are often quiet, sometimes silenced, but always present. These stories are drawn from reports, humanitarian accounts, and testimonies collected over years. They are not the tales of one war or one nation, but of children across the world who share the common fate of growing up in violence. Their names may change, their settings may differ, but the themes are strikingly familiar. In one report, aid workers described a young boy who had not slept through the night in months. Every time he closed his eyes, he would dream of running from collapsing walls, running from soldiers, running from shadows he could not name. His mother said he would jolt awake, screaming, sweat soaking through his shirt, his small body trembling as if the dream were still happening. The boy was 7 years old. Psychologists noted that his nightmares were not just bad dreams, they were a symptom of unresolved trauma. For him, the war did not end when the fighting paused. It lived on in his sleep, replaying itself night after night. Without treatment, such disturbances could evolve into chronic insomnia, anxiety disorders, and severe difficulties in learning or concentrating at school. When asked what he wanted most, the boy gave a simple answer: "I want to sleep without being afraid." Another account tells of a girl, about 9 years old, who one day stopped speaking altogether. Before the conflict, she had been bright, curious, and chatty. After witnessing violence, she retreated into silence. For weeks, she would not answer questions, play with friends, or even respond to her own family. Her mutism was not a choice. It was her mind's way of protecting itself. Psychologists call this selective mutism, a response to overwhelming trauma where a child withdraws from communication entirely. In this silence, she found a kind of safety. Words were too dangerous, too heavy with memories she could not bear to recall. Eventually, with patient therapy and supportive adults, she began to speak again. But her voice was never quite the same, soft, cautious, as though each word might carry risk. Her story reminds us that trauma can steal not only childhood but even language itself. What unites these stories is not only suffering but survival. Each child found ways to adapt, to endure, to keep moving forward even in the harshest conditions. Yet survival is not the same as healing. Without intervention, the strategies children use to cope: silence, withdrawal, hypervigilance, premature maturity, can harden into patterns that affect them for life. Aid workers often describe children who appear fine on the outside but carry storms within. They may smile, play, or even excel in school, but underneath they battle constant fear, nightmares, or feelings of emptiness. Trauma does not always shout. Sometimes it whispers for decades. Some may ask, why dwell on these stories when the statistics already tell us the scale? The answer is that stories humanize the numbers. A statistic can tell us that millions of children are displaced, but it cannot tell us what it feels like to be a child tracing the alphabet under a tarp or clutching a toy while sirens scream. Stories make the abstract real. They also remind us of a profound truth: every child is more than their trauma. The boy with nightmares also loved football. The girl who stopped speaking once adored singing. The teenager in the camp dreamed of being a scientist before his world was interrupted. Behind every symptom of trauma is a whole human being whose story extends far beyond the war. For every story we hear, there are millions more unheard. Children who suffer in silence, unnoticed by cameras or journalists. Their traumas are just as real, their needs just as urgent. The absence of their voices does not mean the absence of pain. This silence is itself part of the tragedy. In many cultures, children are not asked how they feel. Their emotions are dismissed or minimized. When combined with the chaos of conflict, this creates a perfect storm of unacknowledged suffering. Trauma thrives in silence. Listening to these stories challenges us to expand our understanding of what war truly costs. It is not only land, infrastructure, or politics at stake. It is the inner lives of children, their ability to trust, to love, to hope. The boy who cannot sleep, the girl who stopped speaking, the teenager in the camp. They are reminders that the future of any society is being shaped in the fragile hearts of its children. Whether those hearts are healed or left broken will determine the path forward long after the last gun has fallen silent. As we move on, we will explore what science tells us about why these psychological impacts are so powerful. How does trauma literally reshape the developing brain? What happens inside a child's mind when fear becomes a daily companion? And just as importantly, what factors can help children recover, adapt, and even thrive in the aftermath of conflict? Because while the stories remind us of pain, The science can help us understand how to transform that pain into pathways of healing. Stories give us windows into children's lives, but science helps us understand why those lives are shaped the way they are. Behind every nightmare, every anxious silence, every burst of hypervigilance lies a neurological reality. War does not just change circumstances, it changes the brain. Children's brains are remarkable, elastic, growing, constantly forming new connections. This plasticity allows them to learn language, develop motor skills, and adapt to new environments far more quickly than adults. But plasticity is a double-edged sword. While it makes the brain flexible, it also makes it vulnerable. When trauma enters during these sensitive periods of growth, it can etch itself deeply into neural circuits, leaving marks that may last a lifetime. To understand war's impact, we first need to examine the biology of stress. When any person faces danger, the brain activates its survival system. The amygdala, a small almond-shaped structure, sends out alarms. The body floods with stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline. Heart rate spikes, muscles tense, senses sharpen. This is the classic fight, flight, or freeze response. In short bursts, this response is life-saving. It helps us run from threats or react quickly in emergencies. But for children living in war zones, the threat is not short-lived. It is constant. The sirens, the explosions, the instability, all keep the amygdala firing over and over again. When stress becomes chronic, cortisol levels remain high. This prolonged exposure can disrupt brain development, particularly in areas responsible for memory, emotional regulation, and decision-making. In children, this can translate into difficulties concentrating, controlling emotions, and learning new skills. It's not that they lack intelligence, it's that their brains are too busy surviving to thrive. 3 major areas of the brain are especially affected by trauma during childhood. The amygdala. This is the brain's alarm system. In children who experience trauma, the amygdala often becomes overactive. This leads to heightened fear responses, hypervigilance, and exaggerated startle reactions. A slammed door may trigger panic because the brain has been conditioned to expect danger. The hippocampus. This region helps form memories and contextualize experiences. Research shows that chronic stress can actually shrink the hippocampus, making it harder for children to form coherent memories. This is one reason why some trauma survivors have fragmented or blurry recollections. It also contributes to difficulties in learning and academic performance. The prefrontal cortex. This is the brain's rational control center, responsible for impulse control, planning, and problem-solving. Trauma can impair its development, leaving children more prone to emotional outbursts or difficulties regulating behavior. Essentially, the brakes on the emotional system don't develop properly. These changes are not just temporary. MRI studies of adults who were exposed to childhood trauma show lasting differences in brain structure and function compared to those who grew up in safe environments. Beyond brain structure, trauma can influence biology at the genetic level through a process known as epigenetics. Epigenetics doesn't change the DNA itself, but it changes how genes are expressed. Stressful environments can switch on certain genes related to stress responses and switch off others related to growth and emotional regulation. This means that trauma experienced in childhood can leave a biological imprint that persists into adulthood. Even more striking, some research suggests these epigenetic changes can be passed down to future generations. Children of survivors may inherit a heightened sensitivity to stress, even if they themselves never experience conflict. This helps explain the phenomenon of intergenerational trauma we discussed earlier. The science suggests that trauma can literally be carried in the body, not just in memory or culture. Adults are not immune to trauma, but children are especially vulnerable for several reasons. Brain plasticity. Their brains are still developing, making them more impressionable to both positive and negative experiences. Lack of coping skills. Adults may have strategies, however limited, to process trauma. children often don't, leaving them overwhelmed. Dependence on caregivers. A child's sense of safety is tied to their caregivers. If parents are stressed, traumatized, or absent, the child's distress magnifies. Identity formation. Childhood is when people learn who they are. Trauma disrupts this process, creating confusion and instability that can linger. Despite the grim science, there is hope. Children can and do recover from trauma, especially when certain protective factors are present. Resilience is not a trait some are born with, and others are not. It is built through environment, relationships, and support. Stable caregivers. Perhaps the single most important factor in resilience is the presence of a stable, supportive adult. Even in conflict, children who feel emotionally connected to a parent, relative, or mentor show better outcomes. This bond acts as a buffer against the chaos. Community and social support. Children recover better when they are surrounded by supportive peers and communities. Programs that recreate a sense of normal life through schools, group play, or cultural activities provide structure that helps children heal. Education. Schooling is not only about academics. For children in conflict zones, school can be a sanctuary of routine and stability. Studies show that children who can continue their education, even in disrupted forms, are less likely to develop severe psychological disorders. Safe spaces for play. Play is not a luxury. It is essential for healthy development. Through play, children process their experiences, release stress, and regain a sense of agency. Humanitarian programs that establish safe play areas often report dramatic improvements in children's emotional well-being. Mental health interventions. Access to counseling, therapy, or even group-based emotional support can make a profound difference. Cognitive behavioral therapy, adapted for children, has shown success in reducing PTSD symptoms. However, such resources are scarce in many conflict zones. Consider a group of children who participated in art therapy after being displaced. At first, their drawings were filled with images of violence, planes, fire, soldiers. Over time, as they engaged in guided art sessions, their drawings began to shift. Gardens, families, and eventually, dreams of what they wanted to be. Art provided a safe outlet, helping them reshape their narratives. In another case, a boy who had been mute since witnessing violence began speaking again after months of participating in a structured play program. Surrounded by supportive peers and facilitators, he slowly regained his voice, a literal reclaiming of self. These stories illustrate a critical point. Trauma can be mitigated. Healing is possible, but it requires intentional investment in children's psychological needs, not just their physical survival. The science makes one thing clear. The impact of war on children is not just temporary fear. It is a rewiring of the brain, a reshaping of biology, and an imprint on identity. Without intervention, these changes can cascade into lifelong struggles. With intervention, they can be redirected, allowing children not only to recover but to grow stronger. As one researcher put it, the brain is built to heal, but it cannot do so in isolation. It requires safety, connection, and hope. This brings us to an even broader question. If the scars of war affect not only the children who live through it, but potentially their children and grandchildren, what responsibility does the global community bear? Because the trauma of war is not contained within borders. It ripples outward, shaping the future of entire societies and, by extension, the future of us all. We've now seen how war affects the mind of a child, both through stories and through science. But why should those far from conflict care? What relevance does this have for people in peaceful societies? The answer lies in the global nature of trauma. Refugees carry their experiences across borders. Societies are reshaped by the children they raise, and mental health crises, left unaddressed, spill into every aspect of our interconnected world. In the next section, we will explore the global relevance of childhood trauma from war, why it matters not just for those directly affected, but for all of us. It can be tempting to think of the psychological scars of war on children as someone else's tragedy, a sorrow confined to faraway places. But the truth is far more complex. In an interconnected world, the trauma of children in conflict zones does not stay contained. It spreads across borders, cultures, and generations, shaping the global future we all share. One reason is migration. Children displaced by war often cross borders with their families, seeking safety in new countries. These children carry their experiences with them, their fears, their resilience, their disrupted development. Host nations must grapple not only with the logistics of resettlement, but with the invisible psychological needs that accompany it. Without support, refugee children may struggle in school, find it difficult to trust peers or teachers, and face mental health challenges that make integration harder. With support, however, these same children can thrive, bringing new perspectives, strength, and determination to their new communities. Another reason is generational impact. When children grow up in trauma, that trauma does not disappear when they reach adulthood. It influences how they parent, how they lead, and how they build societies. A generation raised in fear may find it harder to embrace trust and cooperation, which are the foundations of peace. In this way, the mental health of today's children shapes the political and cultural stability of tomorrow's world. There is also an economic dimension. Unresolved trauma in childhood often leads to higher rates of unemployment, health problems, and social instability in adulthood. Multiply this across millions of children, and the cost is staggering. Investing in the mental health of children in war zones is not just a humanitarian gesture. It is a long-term economic and security strategy for the global community. But perhaps the most important reason we should all care is moral. Childhood should be a time of safety, learning, and joy. When we allow war to strip that away, we fail not only those children, but our shared humanity. The question becomes, what kind of world are we willing to build? And what kind of future are we willing to accept? Philosophers remind us that suffering is not isolated. The pain of one person, one community, eventually reverberates outward. The same is true here. The trauma of children in conflict zones is not just their burden, it is ours as well. Because the world they inherit is the same world we all must share. And there's a final point, a point of hope. Just as trauma ripples outward, so too does resilience. When children are given the chance to heal, when they are provided with stability, education, and care, the benefits extend beyond their individual lives. They become adults who can contribute to rebuilding societies, bridging divides, and preventing future conflicts. Supporting their healing is not charity, it is planting the seeds of global peace. The psychological cost of war on children, then, is not just a local or regional issue. It is a global challenge, one that demands collective awareness and action. Because if we turn away, we are not only abandoning the children of war, we are abandoning the possibility of a more stable and compassionate future for us all. When we talk about children of war, we're not only describing a humanitarian or psychological issue, we are entering a moral and philosophical conversation about the kind of world we are shaping. War forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. What do we owe to the most vulnerable? What responsibility do we bear when the innocent pay the highest price? Existentialist thinkers remind us that life is not just about survival, but about meaning. The philosopher Viktor Frankl, himself a survivor of immense suffering, argued that even in the darkest times, humans search for purpose. For children of war, this search begins amid rubble and loss. The question becomes, what meaning will they draw from experiences that should never have been theirs? From an ethical standpoint, war places children in situations they did not choose, for causes they cannot control. They are drafted into the theater of violence, not as actors, but as unwilling spectators, and yet they are the ones who bear scars the longest. This raises an ancient moral question. If innocence exists anywhere, it is in a child. To harm that innocence is to undermine the very fabric of human ethics. Philosophy also challenges us to examine indifference. The Stoics taught that while we cannot control the actions of others, we can control our response. But too often, the global response to children in war is silence, or at best, fleeting attention when images surface in the media. The real challenge is sustaining compassion when suffering is no longer in the headlines. There is also the ethical dilemma of distance. For those living far from conflict, it is easy to compartmentalize to believe that war is over there, affecting those people. But moral philosophy reminds us of interconnectedness. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke of the inescapable network of mutuality, the idea that injustice anywhere threatens justice everywhere. The trauma of children in war is not only their burden, but a crack in the foundation of our shared humanity. Another lens is justice. If children carry wounds for a lifetime because of wars they never chose, what does justice look like? Can justice ever be achieved for a stolen childhood? Perhaps not fully. But justice can take the form of support, acknowledgement, and action to prevent repetition. To ignore their suffering is to deepen the injustice. At its heart, the issue of children in war is also about hope. Children represent possibility, the future waiting to be written. When war shapes that future with fear and loss, hope itself is threatened. Philosophically, this is not just a tragedy. It is a warning. A world without hope in its youngest members is a world drifting toward despair. Yet there is another side to this. Just as trauma can be inherited, so can resilience. Communities that invest in healing their children are investing in a future that resists cycles of violence. In this sense, there is both an ethical duty and a philosophical opportunity. By caring for children of war, we affirm that humanity can choose compassion over cruelty, reconstruction over destruction, and life over death. The moral question, then, is not abstract. It is urgent and practical. Will we allow children to inherit only the trauma of their times, or will we give them the tools to build something better? As individuals, we may feel powerless against the enormity of war, but ethical responsibility does not always mean solving the entire problem. Sometimes it means refusing to look away. It means amplifying voices, supporting efforts to heal, and refusing to let indifference be the final response. Philosophy teaches us that meaning can be created even in suffering. Ethics teaches us that responsibility cannot be ignored simply because it is difficult. Together, they point to a path forward. To see children of war, not as statistics or symbols, but as human beings whose dignity demands recognition and whose futures deserve protection. We've journeyed through the hidden world of children who grow up in conflict. Their nightmares, their silence, their resilience, and the science that explains why these scars last so long. We've explored their stories and considered the moral questions they force us to ask. Now comes the most important part. What do we do with this knowledge? The first step is awareness. Too often, the stories of children in war fade quickly from global attention. Images might flash briefly across screens. Headlines might spark outrage for a moment, but then the world moves on. Yet the children do not move on. Their trauma does not end when the news cycle shifts. Awareness means refusing to let their experiences be forgotten, keeping their voices alive in our conversations, our classrooms, and our communities. The second step is compassion translated into action. Supporting children of war does not require extraordinary power. It begins with choices we can all make. Support humanitarian organizations that provide mental health services, education, and safe spaces for children in conflict. Groups focused on child well-being can turn despair into resilience. Advocate for policies in our own countries that prioritize refugee integration, mental health funding, and the protection of children in conflict zones. Educate ourselves and others, breaking through indifference with knowledge and empathy. When more people understand the psychological cost of war, it becomes harder for policymakers to ignore. The third step is imagination, the moral imagination to envision a different future. Philosopher Hannah Arendt once spoke of the responsibility of each generation to ensure that the world is renewed for the next. Children are that renewal. To let war define their lives is to abandon hope itself. But to invest in their healing is to plant seeds of peace that may grow long after we are gone. And here lies the deeper truth. Children should not inherit trauma. They should inherit possibility. They should inherit laughter, play, learning, and the chance to imagine futures bigger than survival. Every child denied this inheritance is a reminder that the work is not yet done. This is not just about charity. It is about justice. A child robbed of safety and trust deserves more than pity. They deserve a world that refuses to accept their suffering as inevitable. Justice for children of war means working to prevent cycles of violence, to build systems of support, and to create conditions where resilience can flourish instead of trauma. Of course, no single person can solve these problems alone. The enormity of war is overwhelming, and it is easy to feel powerless. But collective action begins with individual choices. Even small acts, donations, advocacy, conversations ripple outward. Compassion spreads, just as trauma does. The difference is that compassion heals. As we close this reflection, let us return to the central question. What happens to a generation when their first memories are filled with war? The answer is not fixed. It depends on what we choose to do now. If we turn away, these memories harden into scars that shape a lifetime. But if we step forward, if we offer support, care, and hope, then even the most painful beginnings can be rewritten. Children should never be defined by war. They should be defined by their dreams, their laughter, and their boundless potential. They are not only the victims of today's conflicts, they are the architects of tomorrow's peace. The responsibility is ours to see them, to hear them, and to stand with them. Because in the end, the measure of our humanity is not in how we treat the powerful, but in how we protect the smallest, the most vulnerable, the children who will carry this world forward. So let us not leave them with silence. Let us leave them with hope.